Hi, students. So glad to be talking to you again today for International Public Relations. Well, we've had a lot going on in our world, and almost all of it deals in some way or another with public relations. I know sometimes it might not seem like politics, the election, media, and even things like the horrific tragedy and shootings in San Bernardino has anything to do with public relations, but absolutely it does. All of that in our increasingly small world has to do with public relations and in ways that we might not even begin to imagine. I think after this course, you're going to more readily recognize what these things have to do with public relations if you haven't already picked up on it. Sometimes I think we paint ourselves into a corner of thinking that public relations has to do strictly with learning what we can about people, maybe their business practices, maybe their habits, in order to learn whether or not they'll buy our chicken or pick up our latest and greatest marketing tool, or sign on with our company because it offers them a specific advantage for their telephone service or something. But we don't um, really understand the depth of just how understanding people, culture, groups, not necessarily even internationally, but right here in our own country, um, helps us to better understand, relate, and communicate with the world around us. Because after all, as we learned in the first few chapters of the book, what is public relations? It shouldn't only be a tool that we use to market things, but it is the talk of communications. It's how we communicate with the world around us. So, yes, that has great implications, especially in a time that the world is changing at such a rapid pace. And it seems like we all know about this because of the quickly, and rapidly and integrating layers of social media and the internet. It's around us all the time. It's integrated via, we don't have to turn on our television. We just flip on the switch of a computer, or easier than that, we just pick up our phone. As I've been sitting here chatting, my daughter's been texting me. I thought we had finished our phone call, but she uh, apparently didn't, and just continued texting. So we text, we talk, uh, we may turn on the television, we may watch something via live screen. I'm literally sitting here uh, at my desk in my front room, which has been converted into an office, with two huge screens in front of me that keep me up with what's going on in my world. So as we do that, and as we become aware, and I think by reading your excellent discussions and looking at all the work that you've turned in, I think that everyone by now has a great understanding and has a developed understanding of the fact that in order to um, in order to further an understanding of public relations, that you must learn about culture. You must learn about what makes people the same and different from each other from place to place. And let me suggest that, like I just hinted at a minute ago, it's not just um, internationally, demographically, or geographically from one state to another, one country to another, but even within those states, those nations, and those countries, you'll have different people groups where people will gather according to their traditions and their backgrounds and their likes and their similarities. And so we have this whole world around us. I believe that one of the reasons, besides the fact that we have great access to education in our country. I believe that one of the reasons that the United States has been on the forefront of public relations is that we have so many people. An old term used to be the melting pot, that America was the melting pot. And I do believe that that's one of the reasons that we are at the forefront of public relations. It's simply because we're a place that a lot of people coexist. And because of that, we know a lot about different people and how they interact with each other. But there's always room for growth. We're always learning. As I travel, I learn all the time where I shouldn't really wear red, where I should sit with my feet firmly planted on the floor and make sure that I'm not showing the soles of my feet to somebody. Where as a woman, I should not reach out my hand and try to firmly grasp the hand of a businessman or a colleague, even in public, where it might be taken as an affront, where I should wear a head covering, and actually where it would be an insult for me to wear a head covering as a Christian woman in a Muslim nation, depending on which nation you're talking about. So there's a lot to learn in that world out there as we move about doing business or working with nonprofits. And so keep learning that, because that will help you as a public relations practitioner. It'll help you smooth things out in your work and in your dealings and in your knowing how to establish good communications and what to say. Moving on into this week's very incredibly important chapters. We're going to be talking about a couple of different things, power, models of when things come full circle, capturing the synergy of the circuit, and applying that globally, and then also ethics, incredibly important. What are those ethics besides just being honest? And how do those change? How might they change? How might you be offended by someone offering you, say, a bribe, or hinting that you should grease their palm or hand them a $20 bill? But in their culture, that might be expected or wanted. And you're left with the idea of having to discern whether you're being taken advantage of or whether that's a cultural norm, and then whether or not you want to participate in that. So it's all very interesting as you move about and learn whether or not you're, as a practitioner, you're going to assist in that, in the development of a global company, or even as an individual, whether you want to branch out into a particular country, recognizing some of the ethical dilemmas that you might face. I think it's interesting, just before Syria became involved in their full-blown situation, there was a group, and I believe I talked to you about this in the first week, there was a group of Syrian journalists and public relations practitioners that I met with. And in this chapter, one of the chapters, what we looked at was the idea that, especially in applying ethics, you'll be asked at various times, you will be the only representation of the company that you work for. And these men from Syria, all men, looked at the table, looked at those of us who were Americans around the table, and there were a few educators. I was really the only media person that was there that was practicing media, and there were a few government officials at the table. And we represented to them America. I mean, we were going to speak truthfully about the issues that we faced in the media. Now, I was very interested in that. Here's a group of journalists, public relations people from Syria, where public relations is perhaps different from what we understand it to be, and that's what your text teaches you in the United States. Public relations in a country like that is something that is mandated by the government. They will decide. And they were going through a serious discussion right at that time, but they were the government pretty much decided what would be reported under the threat of imprisonment or even death for those journalists and those officials. So if the government said the people are revolting, then that's what is reported. If the government says the people are wonderful and they're cooperating with us, then that is what is reported. The journalists and the public relations people really had no say. So for them to be questioning us and talking to us about the issues that we face, they are sincerely wanting to know how this works, how we can still, as practitioners and as media people, just what it's like to have the freedom to be able to truthfully report the news. Now, I was sitting there knowing that probably the educators that came to the table, I was forewarned that they had more of a liberal slant than I did, and they may have a different opinion of whether or not the truth makes it out into a newspaper. And sure enough, as we started discussing issues, they were fixated right at that time on the racism, the rampant racism that exists in the United States. And this was about the time right after Trayvon Martin. And so in Florida, and we were in Florida. As a matter of fact, we were in Pensacola. And so if you would have listened to these educators and public officials, you would have thought that we were in the 1950s. You would have thought that we were about to have a march on Washington with Martin Luther King, and that Rosa Parks was just asked to go to the back of the bus. You would have thought that the 50 years that has passed, that there had been no advances in the United States. And while, yes, we have various degrees of racism and people are prejudiced in various ways, I think it would be very arguable to say that we are back in the 1950s. But to these journalists, they were privy to these educators talking about our media and absolutely slamming the media and saying that they do not report the terrible injustices in this country. And that one of the professors or educators said, these were beyond professors, they were heads of journalism departments, said that, well, they had a friend who took their adopted black child to a swimming pool, and they just felt so terrible because all of the other people staying at the hotel were white. And I immediately thought, wow, that was probably based on economics, since it was probably an Omni hotel or a Hyatt or something like that. Anyway, the bottom line was, whatever was in those journalists' mind and public relations officials from Syria was being shaped by this small group, this small room of people. And so finally, I raised my hand and I said, well, I'd like to give you another impression that all of the public relations and journalists and media in the United States are not well represented by one point of view, that we have various special interests, and we have cable broadcast media, we have mainstream media, and we have special interest media. And I said I happen to belong to a special interest newspaper at the time. that was print and online. Now I actually had a special interest newspaper that's online only. And I said, so speaking from the point of view of a newspaper editor that does report, I would have to say that we report to our constituency, to our audience. The people that we're aiming at are a pretty focused group, but nonetheless, we report truthfully. We give balanced reports of what is going on in America as it deals with, in our case, Christianity. Back then, it was Baptist. And I said, but we deal with a number of issues, political issues, legislative issues, issues of social norms, education, feature stories, athletics. And I said, we give a variety of viewpoints, balanced viewpoints, and we do it without restraint, without anybody giving prior review. And we are free to do so. And these Syrians looked at me in shock, in disbelief. They would even be more shocked now because the newspaper that I work for now, I am the executive editor and the director of operations, and our audience is basically the United States, and it is, well, the world actually. And our target is not just, in this case, Baptist. It's primarily evangelicals, but honestly, a lot of people read our news. So we just basically target it towards conservatives in general. And it's not just religious news, it's news that will be of interest to people who are Christians from a wide variety of backgrounds. And so it's not just a particular denomination. But we do that without any pressure, any kind of constraint. That is hugely different whether you're in a public relations mindset, as some of these fellows were, in a journalistic media mindset, which can quickly turn into public relations when it's government or state controlled. And even then, it is particularly interesting, and it is particularly challenging anytime that ethics and your ethics can be challenged anytime your message is not honest. Can you imagine that as the public relations person for an auto industry, you discover in your research that you were not the first person to create a particular part for a car, say automatic windshield wiper, just for instance. And your superiors, however, told you to put this in all of your news releases, that you were the first automotive vehicle company to produce this particular type of windshield wiper for the vehicle. And that's what they told you, but you came back to them and said, no, sir. In my discovery, I have learned that we are not the first. There was another automotive company about 10 years ago that created the same thing, and they sold it for a while, and then they went out of business. And they looked at you and said, well, it's okay, they went out of business, so it doesn't matter. Just do it. What are you going to say? Now, your book talks more about the ethics of change, or the ethics that will change from United States to a different country, bribery, different customs, different traditions. I'm talking about the ethics of learning something about, say, the president of the institution that you work for, and then having to continue to cover news knowing that something is not true, or it's not ethical, or you don't agree with it. What do you do? Those are all very interesting and challenging questions that you'll have to come up against as a public relations professional. More important, well, as important and more important is how you are going to handle those. As an individual, I can always say the word of truth is smarter or sharper than any two-edged sword. You're always going to need to err on the side of truth if you're going to err at all. That's what the scripture says. And so that's what I encourage you to do. I actually gave that same advice to a young woman just months ago who started working for a new company and was concerned about their ethics. So whether it's public relations, and do you have a responsibility to that firm or to the greater, to the person that you're going to be releasing information to? Yes. Bottom line is yes. Whether it's in your business transactions, whether it's how you're representing a company, you do have a responsibility. But as far as the ethics that change from culture to culture, definitely be aware of those and definitely try to step out of those situations. I was in Iraq a few years ago, in Kurdistan, Iraq, and we were laying a cornerstone for a new building. And I was talking with the deputy governor of Kurdistan, Iraq, Gurgish Shleiman, and I had carefully reached out and shaken his hand, and it was kind of, there were some eyebrows that went up. This is a heavily Muslim population, but I knew that he is an Assyrian Christian. And so after our interview, I stepped back and they kind of had a ceremony to lay this cornerstone. And I noticed instinctively as I went up to him and talked to him afterwards, I noticed that he had gotten some cement on his suit coat. And so without even thinking about it, not even thinking about it, I reached up to start, I kind of brushed off the front of his suit. And I said, oh my gosh, your wife is going to kill you for that. Because I was trying to engage in some light, fun kind of conversation. I'm a fun person. Well, immediately he's, number one, he's surrounded by his bodyguards all carrying their huge rifles or Uzis, out here. And I'm like, oh, that was not the thing to do. Well, number two, I thought, oh my gosh, I just touched this man. You don't touch men in that environment. Now, granted, he's old enough to be at least my father, if not my grandfather, old guy, okay? So shouldn't be thought of as inappropriate, except that in that culture, no, not necessarily old enough to be my father. I mean, this is a culture, Muslim culture, where, men have many wives. And if we were out on the street and a man just, basically touches a woman, basically that could be his bride. So not the thing to do. So oops on my part. Okay. But there's a lot of those cultural nuances. And that's one of the things you'll do as a public relations official or practitioner. Is you'll find out what some of those things are. Okay. Had some other things to bring up. And then don't forget, before you tune out on me, one of your assignments this week is going to be the answer the questions starting on page 217. And there's quite a few questions. Don't shortchange this assignment. It's worth 100 points. And you'll be asking questions related to regulations. And you will choose a country to ask these questions of. And I do want to say this. Don't ever underestimate the type of an infrastructure of technology that a country has. You'll think, well, I'll get over there and I can Google this or I can Google that, and I'll be able to do social media and run a social media campaign and create a blog and write daily and check on Facebook and just Twitter some information out. Okay, you're in the middle of Bangladesh. No, you're me. You're in the middle of Jordan. It is 2003. You have decided you are going to blog almost every day about your trip and upload photos and make it interesting for people. Well, What you did not anticipate was that number one, Jordan does somewhat have the infrastructure in Amman anyway to do all this, except that in 2003, women like me do not go into all-night internet cafes. Why? Because I'm a woman. And you know what they do in all-night internet cafes in 2003? Yeah, no. They are not looking at good reading material on those monitors. They're looking at something else. And so they don't want women in those all-night internet cafes. The men in our group let me go once under heavy guard, and two of them stood, one on each side of me, to upload a story. And then they found a local computer lab at the Baptist School in Amman for me to upload some of my stories. And it didn't end up being a daily thing like I had hoped. But I got stories up, I think, every other day and pictures. But that was one of my kind of fails on not learning the local technology before I went. And then my trip to Israel in 2010. Well, who would have thought? Here we are in the middle of Israel. Israel is very advanced technologically, except that we were traveling from hotel to hotel and being hosted by the, of all people, the Tourism Bureau of Israel. You would have thought they would have loved the exposure. Except that every hotel had different electrical fixtures. Every single hotel. So even though I had my little kit and I was putting all my little stuff in, by the time I would figure it out and figure the internet out, I did blog for the first 8 nights out of 12. I got about 3 hours of sleep every night, but I did get my blog up for about the first 8 nights. Hardly any sleep, but I did get my Twitter going, so I had some good branding there. But it took a lot of work, and it took a lot of money because the phone line's extremely expensive at that point, 2010. A little bit better now, but always check out the technology. Okay, so, let's see. Boy, I covered all of that, Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Okay, so the biggest thing I was going to talk about, well, the thing I'll end with is everything has implications. I heard probably the best statement the other day on the news. No, maybe it was a Twitter. I think it was a tweet. Somebody said, no, it was the news. Somebody said, wow, think about the implications. Actually, they made a comment. They said President Obama has failed at public relations by his failure to consider the San Bernardino attack as a terrorism attack. Now, that was early on. After last night, his speech, I think he's basically conceded that it was an act of terror, although he may not have gone far enough for some people. But still, this entire notion that we have homegrown terrorists in America that have grown up in this country and that have been radicalized should not come as a surprise. Anything less is a huge public relations cover-up. Now, I am not a conspiracy theorist, but this all has to do with international public relations. Do we want to be Paris? Of course not. Do we want to be London? Of course not. Is it just as bad over here? Of course. Ask those people in San Bernardino and their families. Of course. Probably worse. They were inside a building at a party. The terrorist that attacked them was a coworker. Now, you can't really say worse because unfortunately the people who were attacked they're gone. Horrible situation. Horrible situation. But what a masterful, masterful public relations campaign by people who would rather us not think that we have a problem with terrorists or guns. And lest you think don't try to make any conclusions about gun control or anything on me. I mean, I'm a veteran. I'm a Navy veteran. I mean, part of our Thanksgiving was to make sure that we were fully armed. So, but understand, international public relations has to do with messaging, has to do with telling a story, has to do with branding, has to do with understanding other cultures. But doing that at the expense of telling the truth is never going to be worth it. So, I am actually proud of Californians. When I saw native Californians, fellow Californians, be some of the quickest people to say and denounce what happened in San Bernardino, and to say that, you know what, we don't jump to conclusions about people, but this was an act of terror. And we denounce that kind of radical Islam. I was very proud of my just being from California. So whether you're from California or not, oh well. But all that to say that it's very important that we learn about people, cultures, and that we think about the implications for how that's perceived. So take that for what it's worth. Call me if you have any questions. And talk to you next week.